I doubt the dean's power to make the Chief Justice sit down, so I'm just going to think he's going to do it on his own. Let me welcome everyone here to the launch of our brand new Institute for Corporate Governance and Finance here at NYU Law School. We're really thrilled about this launch. Thrilled to be a place that will bring together institutional investors, academics, judges, lawyers, bankers, among others, to debate and discuss, to work across disciplines and work on important issues of common interest, both in the academic world and in the worlds of practice. This institute would not be possible without a number of people. First, of course, Ed Rock, our most recently arrived new member of the faculty after many years at Penn, just could not be happier that he's joined us here. As many of you know, in addition to being a hugely distinguished academic, Ed is that rare person who also can bridge the worlds of theory and practice, of academia and practice, did that to spectacular effect at Penn, and so we really look forward to taking things to even greater heights here, and Ed, all of your colleagues on the faculty are just thrilled that you're here. It also couldn't have happened without the founding vision and support of the Wachtell Lipton firm, David Katz, and Marty Lipton in particular. I feel like ever since about 4 seconds after I met him, Marty Lipton has been telling me that the law school needs an institute like this. So if only because Marty and I can now talk about other things, I'm really glad that we have this institute as well. Do want to thank both David and Kevin McCarthy, who've agreed to serve as co-chairs of our board of advisors. And again, great thanks to Marty Lipton. It can never be said enough that really no one has done more for this law school over 60 plus years than this man, and his role in helping see to the launch of this institute is just one example of that, but our gratitude only grows. So Marty, thank you for that. And advance apologies that I need to run almost immediately to a couple of other events, but let me turn things over to David Katz.
Thank you, Trevor, and on behalf of my co-chair, Kevin McCarthy, and we welcome you to our first real program for the new institute. The Institute of Corporate Governance and Finance is something that Marty has said the law school has needed for quite some time, so we're very fortunate to have it here. Being in New York, having access to many of the institutional investors, many of the other types of investors that we have, as well as corporations, academics, professionals. There's really a unique opportunity here to have forums, to have discussions, and to have the type of dialogue among investors and those that are really key to the corporate governance debate in a forum that allows them to be off the record and really make progress in ways that we haven't been able to in the past. So we're really hopeful that Ed's going to talk a little bit about the Institute, but we're really hopeful that this is a new beginning, a new dynamic, a new place for this dialogue to occur. And the law school is going to work very hard to support that dynamic and really provide an opportunity both for students, academics, professionals, investors, and corporations to come together and discuss these important issues. With that, let me introduce Ed Rock, who as the dean said, really is the mastermind behind the Institute, and we're very pleased that he's decided to bring it to NYU.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everybody. This really is our first public program for what I hope will be a really wonderful opportunity to get people together. The Institute starts from the observation that we've reached the point where the de facto deciders in corporate governance are the big institutional investors. That when there's any real controversy between shareholders on one side and boards on the other side, that the ultimate decision is made by the folks from BlackRock, from BNY Mellon, from State Street, from Vanguard, and from a group of other institutional investors. And the thought in launching the Institute is to really come to terms with that, both on the law side, the finance side, and the policy side, as we try to work through what that means for corporate governance going forward. And one of the things I learned early on in my academic career is that finding, and this was something I learned from Bob Mundheim, is that bringing together the top people in the field, in practice, in academia, from the business world, and getting them talking to each other is absolutely the best way to figure out what's going on. And as an academic, absolutely the best way to write papers that are about real issues as opposed to sort of purely academic issues. That the insights that one gets from the people who are working on the hard issues on a day-to-day basis are things that you can't, as an academic, I can't think of it myself, and so much better to shut up and listen and let other people explain to me how things work. And that's what I hope this institute will do for me, and I hope that what it does for NYU and for everybody else is bring the right people together in the room to have really interesting conversations. The institute could not have been launched without, as Trevor said, without the very generous support of Wachtell Lipton, of Marty, of David. The members of the Board of Advisors who are here are absolutely critical to the success of the Institute. What the Institute really, we mean it when we say that our people are our program, because the folks who get involved are really the way that we figure out what is going on and learn the key issues. One housekeeping matter, we have gotten this program approved for CLE credit. So if you want CLE credit, stop and see Stephanie on the way out. She'll register whatever the registration needs to be. Let me turn now to introducing the program on a new paradigm for corporate governance. As I think about corporate governance, and what makes it so interesting is that it exists right at the intersection of law, finance, and politics. That a governance system needs to do basically three things. It has to facilitate the building of great firms so that we can, as a society, get rich. It has to provide for a reasonable degree of accountability of managers who manage billions of dollars of other people's assets. And finally, it has to share the wealth sufficiently that the system will be politically sustainable. One way to understand what happened in November and to understand Brexit is that the old sort of consensus that the goal of the corporation should be to maximize shareholder value, I don't know if that was a consensus or not, but the old vision of the corporation having its prime duty to maximize shareholder value, whatever one thinks about it as a finance matter, was not something that the voters of the world found particularly compelling. And so when I think about the current situation, it seems to me that we have to come up with a new way of conceptualizing what corporate governance should be, a new paradigm, if you will. And not how it compares to some ideal vision, what in Chicago they used to refer to as the nirvana fallacy, but how it compares to politically plausible alternative ways of organizing what we do. And I think of Marty's new paradigm, which has been percolating and circulating around for the last year or so, as an intervention, as a contribution to that public debate of how we should think about the corporation, the governance of the corporation in the current political environment. Marty needs no introduction, but I'll give him a little introduction anyway. He came in the fall to talk to my corporations class, and he started off telling the story of how he went from sitting where you all are sitting, well, we're in a different room, but from sitting where you all are sitting to doing what he's doing. And it's a story of great professional success, but it's also a great story about NYU and how NYU has changed over the preceding years. And if there's one person who is responsible more responsible for that change, it's probably Marty. And he has been, as an NYU graduate, he has been unbelievably generous with his time and with his efforts. And so it is with great pleasure that I turn the podium over to Marty to present this new paradigm in corporate governance. And let me I'm going to turn off the projector so that it doesn't get into people's eyes.
Let me start by first saying that it's not my new paradigm, it's our new paradigm, and in large measure it wouldn't exist except for my colleagues, Steve Rosenblum and Caressa Kane and Sebastian Niles, who are here. We all worked on this together, and I'll tell you a little about the antecedents of it, and then get into it. But I do want to say and thank first Bill Allen, who was for many years the Chancellor of the state of in the state of Delaware, Chancellor of the Court of Chancery, and Bill Allen, who now is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Delaware, but for many years was the Chancellor. Together, they are the true progenitors of what we call corporate governance today, and in large measure, it's Chief Justice Strine and Chancellor Allen who we look to for the learning with respect to corporate governance, and particularly the legal development of corporate governance. The new paradigm is not that. It's not a legalistic approach to corporate governance. It's a practical approach to corporate governance. And it came about, it's not new. It's been around for a long time. Actually, I dated back to 1992 when Jay Loesch, a professor at the Harvard Business School, and I were members of the Committee on Corporate Governance of the United States Commission on Competitiveness. And coming from sort of the opposite sides of the aisle on corporate governance, we sat with each other for, I guess, about 2 years talking about corporate governance. And then one day we were riding back. All the meetings of the committee were either in Washington, D.C. or in cities around the country. But we were riding to National Airport back from the meeting, and Jay said to me, "You know, we're not really that far apart on governance, and I think we ought to write a joint paper for the committee." And we did. We wrote a joint paper. We negotiated it. I took more of his stuff than he took of mine, but we ended up with a paper, and then we turned that paper into an article that we published in the Business Lawyer called A Modest Proposal for Improved Corporate Governance. And that modest proposal contained the basic elements of the new paradigm. It said, it recognized that corporations needed to improve their governance. It dealt with independence. It dealt with shareholder engagement. It dealt with size of the board, the annual agenda, and so on. It covered the field of what is today generally accepted best practices. We didn't have proxy access in there. We weren't even aware that that was going to be an issue one of these days. In any event, we also had in there that companies had to recognize that practical control was in the hands of institutional investors and the big asset managers. And it said that if you're going to deal with your shareholders, you're going to have to deal with them in a fairly stylized way so that they recognize that what you're doing is the best you can, and you're doing the right things, and you have independent directors who are overseeing it, and if you can convince them of that, then they'll support you. And that was 1992, and it sort of became the article on the Modest Proposal really became a map for a lot of the corporate governance that followed it, particularly the 2002 New York Stock Exchange corporate governance rules. So I guess it was 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, Larry Fink of BlackRock took the lead, and he sent a letter to the, I think that first letter was actually to, not to the S&P 500, but to the Fortune 500, but sent a letter to the major listed companies saying that we're concerned that you're paying too much attention to short-termism, and we're concerned that you're not investing for the long term, and we want to encourage you to invest for the long term. And that sort of stimulated a new idea that maybe there was a solution to the problem of short-termism and pressure on companies to focus on short-term earnings rather than on long-term growth. And I'm not going to try and resolve the dispute. There's a lot of dispute today as to whether short-termism is a problem and what the economics are. There's a professor at Harvard who thinks there's nothing better in the world for the economy than activist hedge funds to attack as many companies as they can to force them to focus on short-term earnings. There are others who feel that it's more important that companies focus on long-term earnings. There are those who think that the inequality that has evolved over the last 30 years is a product of short-termism and is responsible for the populist revolts in the US and in Western Europe. There are those who dispute it. Ed made reference to Milton Friedman's 1970 dictum that the sole social purpose of the corporation, business corporation, is to produce profits for the shareholders. The new paradigm gives a little taste of all of that, but is not predicated on it. The new paradigm starts with the premise that its purpose is to promote long-term investment, investment to produce growth over the long term, and to do it in a practical way, to set parameters for the two principal players. Principal player corporation, the business corporation, and how it's going to function to participate in the new paradigm, and the major institutional investors and asset managers and how they are going to function. So basically, what we did is we looked at what we thought was the best of the best in the way of best practices for corporate governance, recognizing that one size doesn't fit all, but we took not just what we thought was the best, but what we viewed as generally thought of as the best practices in corporate governance, and said business corporations will follow those practices. And we looked at the investor side, and we said investors will function in a way, let's call it stewardship, which is the phrase that's frequently used more so in the UK than here, but that investors would exercise stewardship with respect to the companies that they invest in order to facilitate long-term growth. And in order to effectuate the relationship, make it produce the support for long-term growth, corporations following their best practice corporate governance and institutions following stewardship guidelines would engage with each other, recognizing that ultimate control was in the investors and asset managers, but would engage with each other so that the investors, asset managers would be satisfied that the corporations were following good practices, performing reasonably well, and investing for the long term. And the institutions would then support the corporations as against the market or as against activists looking to force the companies into short-term actions that would run counter to the effective, successful investment for long-term growth. And that's basically what the outline of the new paradigm is. The new paradigm should be viewed as a substitute for regulation and legislation. And I'm sure that Chief Justice Strine will speak to it. He's written a fabulous article with a great name, when the wolf bites, who bleeds? Chief Justice Strine has focused for a long time on the true underlying owners of the securities that the institutions manage. Basically, most of the institutionally owned and the major mutual funds that asset managers manage, the ultimate beneficiaries of those securities are people who are saving for retirement, for education, and so on. So they're long-term investors, they're not short-term investors. And in his article, Justice Strine sets forth a number of changes, some legislative, some regulatory, that he would recommend in order to impose on the investors the obligation to fulfill a fiduciary duty to the underlying investors, a fiduciary duty that does not exist in law or regulation today, but a fiduciary duty that could exist. In other words, it would be perfectly reasonable to, if a majority viewed short-termism as a problem and that it was socially necessary to force institutions to support long-term investment, you could impose a fiduciary duty on the managers of long-term funds to actually vote those shares in order to support. The idea was that that legislation wasn't going to come along so quickly, and it was difficult to get any legislation or regulation. We had tried for a number of years to get a very simple change that Congress authorized in Dodd-Frank to shorten the window period on 13D from 10 days to 1 or 2 days. SEC refused to even consider it. And so it was clear that regulation and legislation was not in the offering. So again, one of the basic tenets of the new paradigm was we're not going to have legislation. So is there a way to get the parties together? In other words, satisfy the institutions that they'll still have the ability to force companies to improve management, improve governance, and so on if they're dissatisfied, but otherwise they would support long-term investment. And it was that we sought to achieve by saying, you don't have to sign anything, you don't have to agree to anything. This doesn't require congressional action or SEC action or anything else. If the public companies endorse this and adhere to it, and the institutions and asset managers endorse it and adhere to it, we will achieve the purpose. In the effort to develop it, we contacted, when it was in draft form, this started, really started in 2015 when I was asked by the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum to talk to the group about governance and where things were going, and to basically sketch out what the World Economic Forum could do to promote long-term investment. That ended up in a request in 2016 to come up with a proposal that they could get behind and try to accomplish the facilitating long-term investment, and to try and do it on an international basis, not on just a U.S. basis. And but we found that there really wasn't that much in the way of stewardship in the U.S., that most of the thinking about stewardship existed in the U.K. So while the governance aspects of the new paradigm are essentially U.S. governance, the stewardship aspects of the new paradigm are principally UK stewardship from the Financial Reporting Council and from the UK Investment Association. The Investment Association, group of the largest investment organizations in the UK, had just as we were completing the new paradigm, they came out with their stewardship proposals, and in large measure, we adapted the UK stewardship proposals. And I still don't know whether the U.S. Investors will really accept the stewardship provisions of the new paradigm. The last 18 months, there was more governance stewardship activity than had ever existed before. And we had a group led by Jamie Dimon create the common sense principles of corporate governance with some adherence by major corporations and some institutional adherence. We had the Business Roundtable come out with a new revised set of corporate governance proposals. And just a few weeks ago, we had a group, institutional stewardship group, ISG, which consists of most of the major passive investors and some of the active investors here, and some from the UK and the Netherlands. But while their corporate governance provisions basically mirror the new paradigm and the other US, their stewardship does not come up to the new paradigm stewardship. So the missing element in the new paradigm is the stewardship provisions. Cut through stewardship, what's missing is a commitment by the institutions and asset managers to fully support long-term investment. They're obviously worried about the problem of being sued for having failed to maximize value of portfolios that they're managing by supporting long-term strategies as against short-term strategies that might create more immediate value in the portfolio. So that concern obviously exists, and I don't believe it's a real concern, but there are those who do, and the only way that real concern can be met is if there were to be legislation that would resolve it. And in fact, there could be such legislation. It doesn't look like it's going to be all-encompassing, but the day that Theresa May knew that she was, the morning of the day that she knew she was going to be the prime minister, she made a speech about corporate governance. And it was quite a speech. It included such things as control of executive compensation, included such things as adopting the Continental bipartite board with supervisory board and a management board and union representation and so on. Since she did become prime minister, it evolved into a parliamentary inquiry, which then has evolved into a green paper of legislation. Each step, it sort of got modified down a bit, but it's still hanging out there, and there is a possibility that the green paper will actually result in legislation that does change two things. One, the the UK company law, section 172 of the company law, actually copied the constituency statutes that we adopted here in the US in the 1980s in order to support boards of directors rejection of takeover bids and to make it clear that it was within the business judgment of the board of directors to reject a takeover bid in favor of the long-term growth of the company. Section 172 basically copies the form of statute that was adopted by some 30 states in the U.S. Green Paper actually talks about making it clear that 172 says what it says and that it doesn't prefer shareholders over employees, customers, suppliers, and most importantly, the community. And then just this week, on Monday of this week, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, in case involving the constituency statute in Massachusetts, loudly and clearly said that the board of directors clearly has the right to take into account and actually determined to take a lesser bid for a company on the basis of the interests of employees and the community. So that all of this is floating out there now, and I think the ultimate question is either this is all going to go away and we will continue with short-termism, we'll continue with activist hedge funds seeking to impose short-term strategies on companies, or we're going to get legislation or the new paradigm, probably not in exactly the form it is today, but the new paradigm will be essentially adopted by business corporations and by the asset managers and institutional investors, and will have a modus vivendi that everybody lives together on basically a set of principles that will promote long-term investment. We've put together something that I jokingly refer to these days as the new paradigm, where we just took, again, the best of the best. We took the best of what the Business Roundtable, the common sense principles, the new paradigm, and the same on the stewardship. We took what we thought was the best of the best, and maybe there's an organization called Focusing Capital on the Long Term that essentially first put together by Dominic Barton, the CEO of McKinsey, and by Mark Weissman, who is now a vice chairman of BlackRock, but when it was formed, he was the head of the Canadian Pension Investment Board, and designed to promote long-term investment. And it is an active group. It has just hired a professional president to run it, a woman by the name of Sarah Williamson, who was with Wellington, and maybe they or some other group will pick up this opportunity, because ISG, this investor group, basically, if you look at their provisions on on both governance, engagement, and stewardship basically mirror the new paradigm. So there's hope for the new paradigm, and with that, I'll step down.
Thank you, Marty. Come up. Why don't you can sit here, and then once they finish talking, I'll bring you back up here for the discussion. So we have a distinguished panel of commentators today. I will introduce them in the order as they come to my right, though they're going to speak in a slightly different order. Leo Strine, as most of you know, is the Chief Justice of Delaware. He was the Chancellor of the Delaware Chancery Court before that, and before that he was a Vice Chancellor at the Chancery Court. And way back when, he was a student at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. To Leo's right is Matt Mallow. Matt was for a long time the general counsel at BlackRock, is now a vice chairman, and the proxy voting group reports to Matt at BlackRock. To Matt's right is Jean-Pierre Rousseau, who is the vice chairman of the World Economic Forum USA, which is the US branch of the World Economic Forum, the people who bring us Davos. So here's our Davos man who's here today. And to Jean-Pierre's right is Bob Schumer from Paul Weiss, a leading M&A lawyer, chair of their corporate department. And we'll start with Matt to give his reactions. I've invited people. I want this to be as conversational, as interactive as we can have it. So I'm going to let the commentators make brief remarks. Then I'm going to bring Marty back up. We'll have a conversation among the panel and Marty, and then take questions and comments from the audience. So get your questions and comments ready. Matt.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you for convening this group, and even more importantly, thank you for bringing the Law and Finance Institute here to NYU. This may be the first public launch of a program, but I can tell you from prior experience that Ed's already held seminars and roundtables under Chatham House rules and otherwise, in which we've participated and others, and some of the people probably sitting here in the room. And of course, thanks to Marty, because he has really been the beacon for all of this for, as it was pointed out, 60 years. And that's quite extraordinary. It's unduplicated. Many of you may know that I was at Skadden Arps for 30 years before I went over to BlackRock, before I retired and went to BlackRock in retirement, failed retirement. So we know Marty and his colleagues at Wachtell very, very well. And they've really been at the forefront of all of this. And so, Marty, we do owe you a deep, deep debt of gratitude for this. Let me set the stage a little bit in two ways that I don't think have yet been mentioned, but which really do drive the change, I think drive the change in investor attitude. Let me also mention, by the way, give you the usual disclaimer. I was never at the SEC, but I can give you the SEC disclaimer on behalf of BlackRock, and just accept it as given for the moment. These are really my views, and my colleagues from the Investment Stewardship Group, and we do call it Investment Stewardship, even here in the United States. Many of them are sprinkled throughout the audience and will roll their eyes at the appropriate time when I say something I shouldn't have. But two things have really changed. Yes, there's been the rise of institutional investors, but that has been in large measure driven by the vast increase in retirement and pension funds that have accumulated all around the United States particularly, but elsewhere in the world as well. And so the consequence of that is that about 2/3, maybe it's 60%, but I think it's about 2/3, don't hold me to the exact number, of BlackRock's ultimate clients. We deal with the pension fund, but the ultimate underlying beneficiaries are either people who are retirees themselves, or in many cases, people who are saving for retirement through their contributions to pension funds or outside of that. So if you think about what do? We actually are largely driven, not entirely, but largely driven by the imperative to provide long-term returns for our clients who are saving for what we now euphemistically call the decumulation phase of their lives rather than the accumulation phase of their lives. So that's an important change in the landscape over the last 25 or 30 years, whatever it may be, but it's a very large period of time. The second important change in the landscape from my perspective is the rise of passive investing. Now, there always was passive investing. This is actually not brand new. It goes back 30 years or more. But the fact is that post the financial crisis, it's really accelerated. And it's accelerated in hugely dramatic ways. And so anybody who runs a significant passive investment business, and obviously BlackRock is among them, maybe, and somebody from BlackRock may correct this number, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 40% of our $5 trillion of assets under management, maybe it's even more, that are invested in passive investment vehicles, either through our trust company or through iShares principally. The rise of passive investing means that our job is to replicate an index. It could be the common ones, S&P 500, Dow Jones, Russell 2000, but it could be one of hundreds, if not thousands, of other indices. And we're not trying to outperform the index, we're trying to replicate it and perform as it does. That's the bargain that we have struck with our clients. That's what we've told them we're going to try to do. And that means that we own the shares, and we own them so long as they're in the index. And that's the crucial point for today. So long as General Motors stock is in the Dow Jones index, we're going to own General Motors stock. So long, on behalf of our clients. When I say we, not us, we don't own anything, but our clients will own it, and we will manage it for them. And so the consequence of that is that we have to decide, what do we do with that? Do we sit idly and not engage with companies, not vote those shares? And we actually don't think it's, we think our fiduciary duty demands, actually, that we do vote the shares and that we have views and that we take views on the corporate governance and now environmental and social and many other issues that come across a corporation's management and board's plate. And so, so those two changes are quite dramatic and have really changed the landscape of how we and I think basically how corporations are forced to react in the new environment. So the new paradigm, which Marty has said is aspirational, we hope to sign up both corporations and investors like ourselves, certainly has many attractive features from our perspective. The transparency of what a corporation is doing is certainly something that in what is now Larry Fink's famous letters, he's written I think 3 of them, all the time saying we need long-term strategies, but we want to know what your strategy is. We want to know that your board of directors has been involved in the creation of that strategy and the approval. And since the world changed dramatically this year from last year, we want to know what have you done to react to that? How have you changed your strategy to accommodate the new realities? Now you can see from the diminution of quarterly earnings, from the diminution of companies that sometimes predict what their quarterly earnings is going to be, from the effect of the stock market, you can see how effective we've been. So anybody who says that the institutional investors and the other big institutional investors are essentially similar to us in terms of their investor profile. Not quite always, but generally. You can see how effective we've been in changing and Marty getting adopted a long-term strategy. But we're not giving up, and we're going to continue to do it. Now, we do believe that we will best accomplish a change in the attitude and approach of corporations by following certain principles. And the principles basically are, we think it's the board's responsibility to run to hire the management and determine what a company's gonna do. It's not the shareholder responsibility to do that. We believe that, excuse me, that the best methodology of getting our views across is through private engagement. By meeting with companies, we meet with 1,500 companies a year, something of that sort. We vote at 13,000 meetings around the world a year. Think about that in terms of just the mechanics of doing it, but we do it. And to the best of my knowledge, we haven't missed a vote, although there are other asset managers we all know who have. But we haven't, and knock wood, hopefully we won't. So it's a very big process. We employ the largest group of investment stewards of any asset manager. They number 30, but there are hundreds of others within the BlackRock world that actually deal with the investment stewardship issues. Because not only do we run passive investments, we also run active investments. Large numbers of active investments of very many different types and shapes and descriptions. And those portfolio managers and those portfolio teams who number in the total number of portfolio managers numbers in the thousands, actually, teams of people who do it, several thousand, but the sort of the big ones with numbers in the hundreds. They often have views on investment stewardship, and so we parse through that. We believe that investment stewardship is part of our fiduciary duty, part of our investing as well. And certainly I am old enough, as you noticed. I'm grateful that Ed took down the screen because it showed what year I graduated from here, and I'm only grateful, Marty, that you were. I'm only grateful that Marty is actually 10 years or 12 years ahead of me. So, but the fact is, Marty, that over our 50 years, 60 years, the notions of what is fulfillment of a fiduciary duty has really evolved. It's changed, and it's changed a fair amount, and it presumably will continue to evolve and change. And so we too have to do that. Finally, let me just say that we, Marty, believe entirely in the basic principles of the new paradigm that you've set out here, that it's our responsibility to actively listen and review company communications about strategy, long-term objectives, and governance, to participate in meetings or other bilateral communications with investors, where the investors further engage, and communicating our preferences, our expectations. We put on our website and we all of our standards by which we vote shares. We put a record of every single vote that we take, so anybody who wants to go to our website can find it out, and they can see who we voted for, who we voted against, and the like. So we totally subscribe to that. Where we come up short, so I'll be honest and open and candid with you, where we come up short is on signing on to support every long-term, every management that says we're here for the long term against an activist investor. We don't typically support activist investors, but it's not inconceivable that some corporation could have a management which, while giving lip service to long-termism, doesn't, in our view, live up to it, and some activist may have a program that's an appropriate one. So to sign on totally, in our view, would be to, in some measure, abdicate our individual fiduciary duty to our clients and our shareholders. But certainly, in general terms, we're there, and we've been in support of these programs. So,
Terrific, thank you, Matt. Jean-Pierre, what's the World Economic Forum's interest in corporate governance? Right. There's the World Economic Forum over the years has not primarily been interested in law. It's had other focuses, and over the last couple of years, as Marty described, the World Economic Forum is moving into this space, and you know, from your perspective as somebody from that august organization, how do you react to this? And just tell us a bit about the involvement from the World Economic Forum side.
We don't look at this from a legal point of view, so indeed, Marty Lipton came to last August to our International Business Council and presented a proposal for a compact, new paradigm, a compact for responsive and responsible leadership. In Davos, we produced a one-pager of this, which was signed immediately by over 100 companies, mostly worldwide, but with a majority of Anglo-Saxon companies, of course. But the points I want to make briefly is, number one, the forum is interested, as we say, improving the state of the world, which basically means moving the needle in the right direction. When it comes to corporate governance, it's becoming essential because short-termism has become a disease. I have my scars about facing analysts on a quarterly basis. But the words I want to insist on is responsible, because we see companies responsible certainly to their stakeholders, number one, shareholders, but all stakeholders, but at large to society. And society means, obviously, just to take a couple of examples. Environment. I know in this country, climate change is not popular in some circles, but it's a fact. And companies have to play a role.
Facts are not popular in certain circumstances.
Sorry.
I mean, we just might as well draw this concentric circle.
But companies play a significant role regarding the environment. Second, of course, is health. Because again, companies play a key role in health. Now, companies have also realized that employees are more motivated when they realize their company is engaged in some good things around their communities. The second thing I want to say is that the reaction from the International Business Council, which is 100 CEOs of the largest companies in the world, was very positive to Marty Lipton's proposal. And one of the elements that they recommended is that an index be developed. The concept being that if you don't measure it, you don't know what you're talking about. So how could we design tools to measure, report, implement long-termism? That's the assignment that has been given to a small group of companies and with us and some external advisors as well. And we're supposed to come back to the International Business Council with an index proposal in August at our meeting. So that's probably the most important thing. But to answer your question, that the forum is absolutely committed to this initiative. 40 years ago, or 45 years ago, Klaus Schwab, the founder, instituted the multi-stakeholder model and said, look, if you don't deal with all stakeholders, you're not doing the right thing. So it's not just shareholders, which are still there and still very important, but it's all stakeholders that we have to deal with. That's our commitment. So that's the role we play. And if we can indeed make a difference and move the needle in the right direction in this whole area, we'll be very happy.
Terrific, thank you. Bob Sherman?
So, thank you. And I applaud Marty and his efforts, and I happen to agree with just about everything he says in his report. And I agree with a lot of the prescriptions that he is suggesting. And the world would be a much better place if everybody did follow what was laid out there. But you know, were it be so. And what I worry about is the marketplace, and you sort of touched on this a little bit, Matt, when you talked about the change in investing over the past 30 years, but the marketplace has become incredibly short-term focused. And you look at the amount of daily trades that are generated by computers, by algorithmic trading or high-speed trading, and it's enormous. And you know, the program trading doesn't look at the alpha, it doesn't look at the long-term situation or the long-term prospects of any company, and it hardly looks at medium or short-term results. It's going to look at the daily headlines, and it's going to react to things that happen almost instantaneously, and it's going to trade on this. And this is, again, an enormous amount of trading on a daily basis. So Janet Yellen may say, you know, we're going to increase rates, and then you have the financials go up immediately. And you have the dollar goes long and gold is shorted. And you see that reaction time and time again. And then the ETFs, and the passive, and the index funds, which you mentioned, have to follow that, because they have to recalibrate every day. And so as you have huge changes in the short-term trading, it then, has some impact. What that impact is, I don't quite pretend to understand. But it has to have a significant impact on the market. And then you have the active, managers. And even the active managers who are these days so afraid of underperforming. Or I think, Leo, you even mentioned it in your article, when I guess you called it benchmark beating. But they're all looking at everyone else to see how everyone is doing. And so, and then you have derivatives and you have other things that kind of exacerbate the situation. So collectively, we trade and we don't really invest. And so Marty's entire philosophy is really based on long-term investing, and it's a good one. And I wish, that we could implement a change in paradigm, a new paradigm that would reflect that. But it's very hard to see how that operates in light of what's happening in the markets and how things actually trade. And so the question is, can you do it with sort of, call it a gentle person's agreement? Can you do it without legislation, and can you do it without tax reform? And we all know that legislation and tax reform, or in today's environment, this is not going to be top of agenda. And even if it is, based on what's going on in Washington or elsewhere, they're not going to get it right. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about it. Again, I can't really, I'm not a trader, I can't tell you how these things actually work, but it has to have a significant influence on this, and we have to figure out how to take that into account if we're gonna deal with the issues, because I do believe the issues that you lay out, and certainly that Leo lays out in some of his articles about the need to focus on long-term development and long-term investment are critical. But I don't know how we actually get there. So I'm a little bit of a pessimist when it comes to this.
Thank you, Bob. Leo?
Well, any day, I had my bald head pointed to the back and my eyes to the front, and any day where you get to be introduced by Marty Lipton and in the same sentence with my predecessor and friend and person, I think the world of Bill Allen is a great day, and I didn't see Bill, who is one of the funnier people too in the world. It's a different sense of humor than mine, but one that I enjoy. I want to get the students here. I want to ask students a question as we start this. What companies are most American stockholders of? What if you had to think of a company that had the most Americans' capital, what would they be? Apple? Anybody else? What? None of you know a company besides Apple? Anybody? Anything else? What do you think? Nothing? GE. Okay. AT&T, GE, because they get the nerdy commercials with hiring people. Okay. How about, ever heard of Vanguard? Ever heard about Fidelity? Ever heard about BlackRock? Most of you will not get close to investing in GE, Apple, or whatever those things unless you actually go to work there early in your career and unless your parents gave you a trust fund and you have no loans. Part of what continues to be ignored in this conversation is what it means to be an investor and what I call forced capitalism. The money management industry is a federally subsidized industry. When you get out of NYU Law School, and some of you went in between, you will give a portion of your pay, every paycheck, over to money managers. You will not be able to pick individual stocks and buy and sell. You will largely be given a choice of investment funds that are selected by your employer. They will look like, if you're lucky, it'll be high quality. It could be BlackRock funds, it could be Fidelity.
Oh, they will be high quality.
Right. You will then have access to that money when you, and it'll probably get older over years, but now it's about 59 and a half. Before that time, you will get, people don't like it, law review editors always edit me I put in, I put in Castro-like expropriatory taxes. No, we can't have that. I mean, like, here's news for you. Nobody wants the Caudillos back, but nobody really thinks Castro was all good. But then again, compared to the Chinese, maybe not so bad. But they expropriate people. If you take your money out before you're 59, they're gonna tax you to death. So it's basically given over to these folks for the rest of your life until you retire. Now, you don't give a damn about quarterly earnings at all. To the contrary, bubbles, things that go bad that aren't there, that's not good for you. Noise, siphoned off stuff. But are there separate groups of fiduciaries who have to take your money into account for the fact that they're holding this trapped capital? No. They're not separate funds from other kinds of funds. I react a little bit mad about index fund. I'm an index fund investor because I actually listened when I took economics and I took law school corporate finance. And it doesn't mean that the market's always right, because this is the problem that Bob's getting at. We'll talk to it. The market doesn't mean the efficient capital markets hypothesis and all stuff does not mean that the market is right at every moment. It means that if you try to put together an active trading strategy where you try to outguess the market over time, you are unlikely to beat the collective guesses in the market, and you are unlikely for the excess costs and risks you take to be compensated. And you're better off trying to take a buy and hold strategy over the long term. Ben Graham, before there was indexing, was sort of that point. Why I reacted a little bit to the fact that I buy an index fund for it's a match an index. Well, that's sure as shit, but excuse me, I'm on film, but sure as stuff. What's in the thing I get? But really what I get is a choice of, sometimes incomprehensible, so I get a choice of 25 funds, and I can pick for what I do it. And I pick the closest to rationality. I didn't pick to have a system where I have the least voice because I'm the most rational. I didn't pick to have a system where there's one vote, one issuer by issuer voting decision often made at the fund manager level that flows down, and where my index fund will vote the same as the funds that are long a company. I didn't pick to have them vote yes and no on the same merger in my index fund, because that happens. Happened in the Hewlett-Packard Compact thing, where people who were owned Compaq voted for it because they wanted the premium. People at Hewlett-Packard voted no because it would destroy value. Well, index funds voted yes and no. Why? Because they don't think. Now it's changing at BlackRock, but what I'm saying about this system is, and what you're taught in law schools and you're taught by professors at business schools, is you spend all the time still focusing on the fiduciaries, the people running companies like Apple, running General Electric, and about the accountability metrics for them. For those of you who are ordinary Americans, you will be so far from being able to influence those fiduciaries because you'll have to go through a thing called a money manager, mutual fund. For my friend Lucian, and he is my friend, and he's Marty's friend, and it's an unusual kind of thing to terrorize people because he's very gentle. But he believes you should vote on whether this was still or sparkling, should have been a stockholder vote. He does. But there's never been a situation where there's been, too many derivative sites or too many proxy fights. There's always not enough proxy fights. There's always not enough stockholder proposals. There's always not enough. Then you look at the people who actually hold Americans' capital, and you have no effective mechanism to actually change fiduciary ownership. There's very little litigative accountability, and there's very little accountability to the actual investor in terms of performance over time, because you really can't switch out of the industry. And for example, I'll give you a Lucian in terms of academic terms. He always say there's students a thing called the Wall Street rule. The old rule ought to be, if you didn't like your investment, you would walk. It was rarely worth it to exercise voice because of the cost. Well, the folks who propose our new system never look at the application of their own theories about the Wall Street rule to the actual people whose power they continue to pump up. Because the end user investor's capital can't do the Wall Street rule walk. They're not the ones They can't even do that. And so the point at all. And so if the Wall Street rule is not an answer for Fidelity, Vanguard, BlackRock, and the public pension funds, how can it be that there's an answer for the ordinary investor that you just switch funds? Because you're gonna get the same kind of governance, because this is what Bob and I think are getting into. I don't like to demonize anybody. I think it's silly to just demonize people. You have to look at their incentives. And I'll finish with, I applaud the new paradigm. Marty and I have been working on a lot of these things. He'd like to go further, so would I. It's at least a nod in the right direction. But I am skeptical that boundaries and power do not matter. My friend Lynn is over there. She and I think, share most of the same values. We share a different belief about power. I don't believe that power is unimportant. I believe it is the most important signal of what society cares about. We do not debate in our polity that our polity is about human beings. That does not mean that we can't care about the environment or the arts or other things. But as human beings, we decide what value to give to those other things. We did not put in the US Constitution that this is about human beings. We might have put some things in it's about some human beings, but we never actually, Matt or Marty or Ed, we never put in there that we're not a multi-constituency republic. We didn't say the trees are equal to the people, or as much as you love your dog, that they're equal to the people. Why? Because we built a republic where the only citizens who are capable of being citizens are human beings. Well, in the American corporate republic, and Europe is totally confused on a lot of this stuff, because they have stakeholder BS right next to direct stockholder action, and they're actually, one of the problems is their model's changing. Their old rules apply to different games, and they're now having rules used by American activists. But the point is, when you only give power to one constituency, which is the stockholders, to expect a group of people that's only accountable to one constituency to be better than the world and to balance all these interests, I just think I happen to be come out of two people whose views of the world were both distorted in Chicago, Adolf Berle, the good Adolf, and George Orwell. Power matters. And I think what we have to talk about today are whether you can actually get to where Marty wants to go without more accountability on the behalf of the people who actually invest capital. Whether we're using economic pricing. For example, almost any state you go to has fuel taxes, sin taxes, and basic sales taxes. It is amazing to me how people still buy clothes and other things in states where the average sales taxes are 6 or 7%. But we say on an economic trade in the United States that even if you had a fractional tax of less than 1%, that somehow economically useful trades will not occur. I would actually argue that anybody who says to you that if a trade will not occur, if you pay a fractional tax of less than half of 1%, I would say that's a socially useful move to tax that transaction, because that's exactly the kind of transaction that is pure speculation, increases externality risk, and tilts the markets in the wrong direction. So I think looking at things like first best tax policies that actually apply old-fashioned conservative economic principles about externality risk and having a trading tax, looking at more patient capital models, I think are important. And frankly, some fiduciary requirements for the center of the plate investors so they can actually do what they want. They're at a comparative disadvantage if people don't have to actually, if we're gonna make people vote, for example, and I will finish on this, if we're gonna make people vote, if it's important enough to make people vote, and I've said this to Lucian, then they should do it well. And they should have to do it in a way where they're aligned with the interests of their investors. ISS has voting things. They did change the horizon after, and I'm not against ISS or anything like that, but they were a symbol of market failure. They only exist because of a government mandate to vote. Lucian is not true to his principles, because if he was true to his principles, he would allow institutional investors to decline to vote on things that they think are socially useless. The problem is we've now put we've changed the inertial direction of people who are along the company. We've changed the inertial direction of their votes towards change. because it used to be you actually had to bring out enough of the electorate to change the status quo. Now, because they'll kick your butt if you don't vote, you have a situation where when any of you in the room, students, when you don't really want to do something and it really doesn't count against your grade, do you do a lot of thinking about it? No. If you can just walk up and say, I voted, and have a reason for it, and it not cost you anything, well, that's the republic we have. And so I think Marty's trying to get to a better place, but I think the central concern I have with it is the accountability around the one side of the equation, which are the people who are actually running the public companies and actually doing the economic creativity that really leads to genuine wealth. They are under the big lights of the market. They have all the regulatory inputs, they have all the litigation inputs, they have the ballot box inputs. The other side, the people who actually are the direct fiduciaries of most Americans and most Europeans, their accountability framework is entirely unworked out and undeveloped. And so I think we're sort of muddling through and looking at for leaders like BlackRock and Fidelity Vanguard to start to step up, but I'm a little dubious about that, so.
But Your Honor, would you have fiduciary duties imposed on BlackRock?
Again, I think the term,
For the benefit of the.
here's the thing,
shareholders.
I think that if we're going to have regulation at the federal level about the money management industry that we federally subsidized, then I think there should be smart regulation. Smart regulation means if you're gonna make people vote, and we do make people vote, that the voting policies they have should take into account the investment horizons and philosophy of their investors. That when one of the few things Strine's smart enough to do is to invest in index funds, my index fund should be balancing the stupidity of the gerbils on the wheel who are proposing idiocy.
But it is.
No, they don't. That's not true. In many of these things, and I do actually do empirical stuff, and I look at the data. People vote the same way in many of these funds. I found, for example, in social proposals, Bob, I did a study of social proposals. There are funds which are socially responsible mutual funds within fund complexes. How they invested was different from the other funds. But all the funds actually that pick stocks vested a little differently. You know, it was exactly the same.
Well, because.
No,
most
let me,
times the
no,
people
let me,
different.
no,
The
let
vote-
me,
The people who vote, the people who invest are not always the same.
no, and let me tell you what they did. So, on social proposals, things like climate change, which I believe in, I actually believe in. I believe in actuaries and scientists when they are united unanimously. That's actually not a good thing to bet against, actuaries and scientists when they're influenced. Bob, they voted against all the social proposals in the same proportion as every other fund in the complex because there was a fund-wide voting decision. So people who had chosen to give their capital to funds that invest on a socially responsible basis were having them vote against climate change things, fair worker policies, sustainability policies. That is ridiculous. And by the way, the Americans and Europeans and Asian people, working people's money, it should not be the play toys of a bunch of idiots who run around and have fun and go to Mandarin Orientals around the world and talk about social proposals and litigation. There's a lot of people in this who make a lot of money off of just a lot of hoo-ha. And it's a lot of rent seeking and it's real. And we're all sort of part of it and it's fun, but it actually hurts real people. And it diverts attention from people in businesses from creating value. It also leads, and I'm passionate about this, it leads to ways of doing business that involve not investing in your human capital and creating wealth in a socially responsible way. And for most of you who are students in this room, you will not earn your living because of your investment income. You will derive your wealth from your sweat. And it's not until you get to the very top of the income distribution in the society where it gets to be even close to relevant how much you really make from your investments. How much you have invested turns almost entirely on your access to a good job over a long time where you can provide for your family.
Marty, let me get you back up here to respond to the commentators, and then we will open it up to questions and comments from the audience.
Wish I knew how to respond. Well, let me start with Matt. I think that the section that you read from the new paradigm is at least balanced by three other sections, which essentially say, and that if the institution or the investor is dissatisfied after it's engaged, it's free to do whatever it. And if we could get ISG to buy into it, we'd sharpen that language any way that ISG wished it sharpened. And I think I could sell that to the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum. And Jean-Pierre is nodding his head, so now I know we could sell it to the WEF. Chief Justice Strine and I have been at this a long time, and we even tried very hard this past year in another context with an Aspen Institute group, and then ultimately with a group that I described as far right, right, middle, left, and far left. And we had all of them together in a room, and we had fairly interesting discussion for half a day, and we accomplished absolutely nothing. And
We had some of the worst sandwiches that were ever created.
well, but the cookies were good. In any event, these are very, very difficult issues to get agreement on. I must say, the people who have worked on this and have debated it and so on have all done it with a view toward trying to accomplish something, but there are fundamental beliefs that people hold. The economic group at the American Enterprise Institute don't believe that short-termism is a problem. They think that the Chicago School of Economics has been absolutely correct since 1970, and that the failure of the efficient market theory should be ignored, and it's still Milton Friedman all the way. So they hold that belief, and there's no way we're going to get concurrence with those things. One thing that I think is crystal clear today is that we're not going to get legislation in the United States that would do anything along the lines of what the Chief Justice suggests in the Wolf Bites article. All of those, he and I disagree with respect to the transaction tax, not on the substance of it, but on the politics of it. I just think it's impossible to get a transaction tax.
No, I agree that we can never get people who call themselves conservatives to actually follow conservative economics, which is why we could never, for example, tax carbon, because we couldn't possibly go with the first best conservative economic approach to reducing the externality.
Bob,
Came from the Heritage Foundation.
yeah.
Yes, because they wouldn't do the first best, which would be
Single
confirm.
payer.
And tax and pay, anybody think, any student in the room believe cap and trade was a democratic idea? Wasn't.
Or Obamacare.
Was the Heritage Foundation second best because they wouldn't tax the externalities, so they did cap and trade?
Yeah.
Then when the Democrats adopted the second best Republican alternative, it became President Obama's alternative.
And as Bob pointed out,
I agree with
the Affordable Care Act was a Republican idea.
That was Romney in Massachusetts.
Well, I mean, Marty should give the background.
Romney was the Heritage Foundation.
Marty and I should give the background. One of the things we were trying to achieve, right, Marty, was that we did see among some of the political candidates last year, and even frankly the current president, we saw some agreement around issues like the need for infrastructure revitalization and an indication that even if you just put aside, you know, even if you go back to the John McCain thing, right, Marty, and you just say it's better to be environmentally responsible than not, and that it could provide America with a comparative advantage, that you might want to do something like infrastructure investment. That people seem to be focusing on a little bit on, you know, the so-called Main Street versus Wall Street, even wanting, frankly, to temper some of the intrusive regulatory aspects of Dodd-Frank, and maybe have some pricing policies like pricing friction, that would deal with some of that itself. And we were trying to actually look at something that was a centrist agenda. I think we now know, we can't figure out what this is now.
I keep trying to get Leo to run, but he won't.
Marty, let me
And
throw
I just wanted to say one thing, Bob's point, which obviously is correct, except I would fundamentally disagree that this speedy trading and all of the things that one would deter with a transaction tax and so on are in any way socially useful. I don't think they add to liquidity. I think that where we've fundamentally gone the wrong way, we've basically financialized the economy. And by doing that, we encourage short-termism, not just with respect to corporate business strategy, but we're encouraging short-termism with respect to the entire economy. And it's led to.
I couldn't agree more. I think I'm not applauding it, and I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying it's a fact of life, and unfortunately, we have to deal with it. And I don't see, you know, legislation being adopted that is gonna deal with it or anything else right now. Unfortunately, the only thing that's gonna deal with it is another market meltdown. And then we'll have to pick up the pieces.
I think there's-
and hopefully we'll do it a little more
I think there's
rationally.
another thing that we were thinking about too, which is that what we need as, I'll use the OECD as a sort of proxy for the enlightened form of market economy that we've prided ourselves on since the big war, and that wasn't the Grenada thing, it was the WW2. Is we all know that we have social fabric issues to deal with promises to aging folks and people who have needs, and I would like to think that we would want to meet those. We have challenges of investing in infrastructure and in dealing with climate change. Transactional taxes dealt with OECD-wide is a very efficient way of dealing with it. Carbon taxes are too, and they won't shut down the world. And they're actually the sort of things that you actually want to reduce these arbitrages. You don't want Cook Islands. You don't want, frankly, you know, I have Bono. I got problems with Bono. I'm sorry. Here's my problem. Do you know he's Dutch?
He's Irish.
U2's Dutch. And you know why? Because they didn't want to pay their taxes in Ireland. So when a leftist, I'm on the left, but I pay my frickin' taxes. I don't, you know, when he inverted, he was on the cutting edge of inversion. But here's the thing about the fractional taxes. I think it's important to keep in mind, because I would like Matt, you know, Marty knows. I didn't just focus on the fractional tax because it should apply to just the speculative traders. It provides a benefit to money managers who are tempted to deviate. There's a lot of problems when you have to compete on Morningstar ratings and other things like that. money managers face, there's a lot of good money managers. If you talk to some people from Fidelity and Vanguard, they lost some really good active managers just out of being dispirited during weird markets. Because you try to hold it in there, you're losing funds under management. Some of my Democratic friends in the Hill wanted to exempt from a trading tax ordinary investors in 401k. And I think it has to apply to everyone, because part of what you want to do is when people trade funds, you want it to apply to them. When active traders trade stocks, you want it to apply to them. Because you want over time for that to also account in the returns and for investors to think about what they do to the money managers, because it's a two-way relationship, honestly. And we don't really use many incentives, but I agree with Marty. I mean, I'm not sure, we thought we were fairly close to some rational conversation, because we could find, one of the things we went through is we looked for Republican and Democratic elected officials, Republican and Democratic economists who were respected on a lot of these kinds of ideas. And it was really easy to find very sensible people who were for a lot of this. Now, of course, they've all,
So Marty, let me pose a question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Does one have to be with you on the short-termism issue in order to be with you on the new paradigm? It seems to me that you could have a completely orthodox finance view on short-termism and still think that with the current distribution of shareholdings and balance of power, that the new paradigm makes sense.
Oh, I agree. No, you don't. It's to encourage long-term investment. It's not to mandate it. In other words, it is to enable companies who adopt a long-term strategy to pursue that strategy. But it doesn't guarantee the strategy is correct or that it isn't subject to change at the instance of the shareholders who decide they don't like that strategy any longer. So, no, it goes to the question that Matt raised, and to the extent that it's not clear in the new paradigm, clearly that should be corrected, because there's no intention to lock in long-termism. And Colin Mayer, the Oxford professor who you know well, has just written in an article for the Oxford Review. In fact, it's a compendium of, Lynn is the one who sent it to me just the other day, and it's a brilliant article on all of the different issues that arise, and he comes to the conclusion that Chief Justice expressed, that it's not really possible today to deal with all of these issues other than a comprehensive review of the entire business corporation ethos. That have we ended up in a situation where we're not really fulfilling the fundamental purpose of maximizing growth, maximizing the creation of value for people, and having an equal distribution of that value. And those tensions show up in every aspect of this. Things like union representation on the board of directors. Interestingly enough, it's worked just fine at GM as part of the settlement. A UAW official is on the GM board, and it's worked just fine. GM has done extremely well since it came out of reorganization, so on. So I think long run, Colin Mayer is correct. We need to redo it, but that happens only in a dream world. We're not going to redo the whole structure and so on. So I think we have to take it step by step. We've tried to take some major steps. They didn't come off, so we have to take shorter steps, and hopefully they'll at least improve the situation, but they're not a permanent solution unless that it's possible, and I doubt it, but I might hope for it, that we could get a full understanding with respect to what is the right approach to the creation of value and the distribution of value. But so far, I gave some thought to starting the discussion of the new paradigm in 1720, seriously, with the South Sea bubble. And I've always felt kind of that we made a mistake in the Constitution. The bills of attainder can be very useful if you've suffered a loss from bad management. In any event, literally, no one has, throughout all of history, come up with a rational solution to it, or an economic theory that has stood the test of time. Everybody thought that the efficient market theory was absolutely correct and so on, and I didn't, but everybody else did. And then it gets, Robert Shiller has demonstrated it's nonsense, so.
Matt, you wanted to jump in, and there's one here.
Well, I just wanted to, although it's a little hard for me to remember everything the Chief Justice said, because it's now 20 minutes ago, and my memory capacity is shortened these days. But I wanted to comment on a couple of things. One is that it is absolutely true that all of you who will invest in a BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, whoever's fund, cede the right to vote to the manager. Because we haven't developed a system whereby we pass through the vote to the underlying beneficial owners. But I point out to you that the managers do vote, and in our general elections, the people do not. So we get 40% of the population, or whatever it is, who are eligible to vote in the presidential election voted, or it's half the people, whatever it is, it's a very small percentage. So I wonder if we had developed something that would pass through the vote to our underlying beneficial owners, whether we'd have any better system. That's the first point. Second, the Chief Justice is absolutely right. When you start at age 25 or whatever it is to put money away in a retirement plan chosen by your employer, you may have a menu, but it's limited. It's not going to be a broadest, and invest anywhere you want, and it won't be invest in Apple directly, that's for sure. On the other hand, we need to develop and have a system that actually does at least have some prospect that when you get to be 59 and a half or 65 or now 70, where people are working longer, you will have some accumulated nest egg, because all of you who are in the back of the room have never tried this, but some of you in the front of the room do get Social Security. And it's not something anybody can live on in the city of New York, in Manhattan easily, and it's not something that's really as a real safety net in most parts of the country. It's a nice supplement, but you are at the poverty line or just above it if you are reliant solely on Social Security. So we need to develop some system that allows you to save along the way, and saving with at least some prospect of a return is hopefully a better system. Now, whether that's a professional money manager or some other way, we could have a debate about it. And certainly over any 50-year period, or almost any 50-year period you pick, investing in an index fund that's broadly representative of the market and diversified, since, who was it, Harry Markowitz or whoever said diversify, probably has gone up a fair amount, even though they've had dips, and many substantial dips along the way, but if you hold it for a sufficiently long period. So we need to develop some system, and we've developed a money management system to do that. And thirdly, I can tell you, and this is being supportive of your view, if you look at the statistics of votes on things like Say on Pay, which is a very hot button issue, and it's very emotionally laden, and may not be the best issue, but if you look at those votes, you will see that Many companies, not many get beaten on it, but many companies wind up getting 25 or 30% voted against them on say on pay. But then you look at the parallel election of directors at the very same meeting, and those directors get reelected by 90-something%. And that's something which we've said and we believe that it's not the say on pay vote that's the important vote. It's the vote on the comp committee or the directors who created the pay scheme that we don't think is appropriate. Or we
But
think
it's
is
often the
excessive.
pay scheme
Right.
too, that they voted on, the same pay scheme they voted on 3 years in a row.
Correct.
And they switched because something happened that year, not because of the pay plan.
Yes, but they don't vote against the directors
No, they don't.
who created the plan.
But can I ask you a question? I mean,
Let
one
me
of the, can I ask
Jean-Pierre-
Matt, can
Let me
I?
get Jean-Pierre into the conversation.
Briefly, I want to make 2 points. One is that there's a difference in short-termism. We should distinguish between short-term investing and short-term actions by companies and CEOs in particular. I'll focus on the second one because obviously I'm not a fan of short-term trading. But when it comes to companies and CEOs, they have to face into short-term decisions. And that is not necessarily bad. So short-termism in that context should not be always be seen as negatively, as long as the CEO keeps his eye on the long term and has his long-term strategy well developed, well understood. Second point, it seems to me that a company which has a good image in the public, a good image with its stakeholders, its employees, but the public at large now is very sophisticated. The young generation has access to lots of information about quality of products, origin of products. And the image in the public will make the company on a long-term basis. Those companies who do make real things, design products, make products, sell products, they have to deal with their image. And it seems to me that if they have a good image, then they're worth investing in because it carries a promise of good results. And therefore investors should be investing in those companies that have a long-term strategy and are doing the right things, meaning a good image, good products, and good everything. So that would be the righteous circle, circle to pursue, and that's what what we are pushing in the World Economic Forum is that this is the way we should go in that direction. Because the young generation, believe me, I'm not from that generation, but they're different. And they have access to information completely differently than older generation has, and deal with it completely differently.
Let me turn over to the audience to get questions, comments from the audience. Stuart.
The way I see the short-term issue, there are 2 aspects of it, similar to what you said, slightly different. One is the company being managed for the long-term growth, not for its short-term earnings? So that do they make investments in capital expenditures versus making sure each year each quarter the company does better than the quarter before or the year before? And that's one aspect that I don't see any issue. I mean, I don't think a company should be managing its earnings to please the stock market and how to show a steady growth. But the other aspect of activism or short-termism is extraordinary transactions. Whether a company should be sold, whether it should spin off a division, whether it could even be whether management is just ineffective. And those decisions, to me, seem like they're particular to the situation. I mean, I don't think you would say that no company should be sold if the company doesn't want to be sold. It may make sense, it may be rational to have a company sold. And the only way you could analyze that is to look at the situation and see, what the issue is. Should the company be divided? And does that make more economic sense to the shareholders, to the whole community? So I see these two different aspects, one very different.
Can I-
Let me collect a few comments from the audience, and then we're gonna have a final run-through on the panel, because we are unfortunately running out of time. Jeff Gordon?
It seems to me we might be mistaking the effect that governance has as in the economy. It's in a general way. The macroeconomic environment has a major factor in what the right term investing is. And in an environment in which the euro may not exist in a year or two, or the stability of major financial firms is at risk, that's hard to invest, quote, for the long term. I mean, in a similar way, it seems to me that the new paradigm, the stewardship, et cetera, really misses the lesson of the last election, which is to say that the adjustment costs of economic change and the competitive pressure that trade brings on, the competitive pressure that good governance brings on, that's the issue that is really before us. And I think from the maintenance of the system, its ability to invest for the long term or the short term, it would be a good idea to bring these collective energies to focus on how these adjustment costs of economic change can be better addressed. Because I think what we're learning is that if those are not addressed, then the legislation that may result will not be about a change, voting rules, but will be a change that'll go in a much deeper way that I don't think probably would be to the taste of many in the room.
Bill Anderson?
It's funny to have need a statement like this, that long-term is a good way to run things rather than the daily stock price is an unbelievable thing. But the market is speaking with or without these changes. We had a session last week out on the West Coast with Donahoe, who's the CEO of eBay, the chairman of Microsoft, Thompson, Jeff Ubben, and the audience was mostly tech CEOs and CFOs who were not public. And they're saying Apple, Qualcomm, great companies that are in the tech space, or outside of the tech space, Pepsi, a lot of pressure on short-termism. Why are we going public? Why would we ever want to go public? And if they are going public, they're going public with dual class. So the market is, if the institutional shareholders are not going to address that, the market will speak by not having companies go public or go with dual class. I would just say there's a couple of things when you think about implementing the paradigm to some market issues. One thing is, I think a lot of shareholders are for the long term, even activists for certain ones of them. But there is, when a company has a demand for change, it usually takes about 3 months for a vote, and directors do not want to go through that. Maybe they should know they should be going through that. But the way to get, when we were defending Cadbury a few years ago, we called 7 or 8 shareholders. They gave us their views, and we know what to do. In an activism or a hostile situation nowadays, the mutual funds, it's tough to get their view. They have a view, they don't want to share it. Man, you have to get to the long term, you need to give the voice back to the companies earlier than wait till the vote. And the second thing is, I think, transparency. And I think what Markel pointed out around and Marty and even the lead on the 13D filings. But in the last year, we've seen fights where the shareholders have had debt positions and all kinds of positions across the capital structure. The same kind of transparency that companies have is not applicable to the investors. And I think you add a little bit of that and ask them how long the activist is going to stick around after the change is made and whether they're willing to commit to that. A couple of modest changes here, a little earlier feedback in situations, a little more transparency. I bet you that would be pretty helpful.
So let me now turn it back to the panel. We'll start with Bob. And further thoughts, final thoughts from panelists, and we will close with Marty.
So I agree with Bill. I think that will make a difference. They're small, little steps that try to get there. And I think Marty's whole paradigm is aspirational, and it's good because it focuses people on the right things to focus on. But again, unfortunately, I just think market realities will necessarily dictate a different outcome, and we're gonna have to figure out how to deal with that in order to come up with a solution that could work.
Jean-Pierre?
I think that the point I made is that we intend to develop tools to measure, report on long-termism, on companies that have the right long-term strategy and what they do and how they do it. We are working to have this index, we use this word, by this summer, and we'll see where we go with this. But the key feelings among the CEOs in Davos is that we ought to measure this. We ought to find a way to assess this, to make sure it's not fluff.
Matt?
I agree with what my colleagues to my right have just said. I just want to point out that tech startups have access to capital as private companies at a multiple. So going public has a whole different meaning than it might have done 15 or 20 years ago, where you couldn't get a multiple except by going public. Tech companies can I mean, we invest in private companies, so does everybody else. So it is a slightly different world. Look, I think the one party that's missing here on this panel is a company. Is a real company. You were a CEO of real companies, but a real company that faces the daily pressures or the quarterly pressures or whatever, and getting their views would be helpful. But I think that the discussion and the debate needs to be continued. I think it's a very healthy thing, and we're moving clearly in a direction we would all support. And I think it's a tough slog, but it's well worth continuing to do it.
Yep.
I'll finish with just 2 points. One, in honor of a mention of Silicon Valley, one granular, which is there is a promising legal development that has a realist tinge to the thing, which is called the Benefit Corporation. And I think that in the Silicon Valley and others, it allows you, and this goes into the change of control, it allows you to essentially temper the Revlon doctrine, but with enforceable duties to a commitment to sustainability. And that there have to be supermajorities in the context of transactions where that commitment to that sustainable approach goes away. So it's a modest but realist thing that actually gives some power to it. On a bigger picture thing, I want to mention something again to the students to think about this whole overlay of how perfectly sensible things that people who have spent most of their money, except for me, I guess I'm the human who hasn't made money and I'm the sort of investor, but perfectly sensible people of the center, right, and left could agree on in terms of doing more pricing incentives and less sort of nitpicky regulation, things that would move the dial around disclosure, how those could all be done, but why can't they be done? And it relates to something about this money management machine and what's done. One thing I think Matt would agree on is that none of you in the back will be giving your money to Matt or Fidelity or Vanguard as an expression of your human values and for them to pollute the political process. And it's also true. It's also true that nobody.
I agree.
And nobody, but I'm going to come back to what you do about it in a second. And no one gives their money. Nobody invests in. You know, I'm an index investor, so I have money in ExxonMobil. I have money in all these things. I don't invest in them. And frankly, conservative economist Milton Friedman believe that nobody invests in companies in order to be an expression of their political values. But the reality is that we have freed our society's corporations to pour money into the political process, and they're all doing it in their own space. Marty will tell you, we got great reaction to our Aspen piece. Everybody came back to us and said, 95% of what you say, we're with. The 5% that asked anything of our particular industry to be part of the solution, we can't be on board of. Well, guess what the money managers have decided? Because they know that when they have people's money, they can't rationally represent them in the political process. They've decided to actually abstain on whether corporations should give political contributions. Most real corporate CEOs don't want to give money, and it was a great excuse to be able to say no. But the reality is corporate money is going all the way into the political process sideways. And when you look at all the solutions we've talked about, from the thing of pricing the energy taxes, to pricing speculative trading, to dealing with disclosure from activist hedge funds, All of those things are heavily influenced by moneyed interests. And by the way, it is not a polity that we would want. We do the individual industry lobbying for what is most important to their profitability, and each of them getting individually what they want does not add up to what an actual living, breathing human investor wants in terms of the creation of wealth and health in a society. And that is an aspect of that this wonderful institute that Marty and you have created can discuss in the future.
Well, I think we've had an excellent discussion of the new paradigm. I think we've actually explored the various aspects of it, good and bad, and I very much appreciate it. And I think that we've had a very nice start to the Institute, and I want to thank Bob and Jean-Pierre and Matt and Chief Justice and you, Ed. So thank you all, and thank you all.
Please join me in thanking Marty.